The invoice arrived itemized in a way that made my stomach turn the moment I actually read the line items closely. $600 for our family's annual pool amenity access. 3 times what our neighbors across the street had paid for the exact same access that same year, with a small notation at the bottom reading, "Non-original owner surcharge applies." A fee category I had never once heard mentioned in the 4 years since my husband Teodoro and I bought our house in Ashcombe Meadows. My name is Marisol Okonkwo Delacroix. I want to establish something clearly before I go any further, because it matters enormously for how this entire situation unfolded. Teodoro and I purchased our home in Ashcombe Meadows from a family who had lived there since the development was first built, meaning we were, in the specific language the HOA apparently used internally, second generation owners rather than original purchasers from the developer, a distinction that, until that invoice arrived, I did not know carried any practical significance whatsoever within our community's fee structure. The woman responsible for this surcharge was Priscilla Vandermeer Ashby, president of the Ashcombe Meadows board for a little over 2 years by that point. I want to walk you through how I first discovered this wasn't simply an error on our own bill, because that discovery ended up mattering enormously for how large this situation eventually became. I called the HOA management office the day the invoice arrived, assuming, reasonably I thought, that a tripled fee for identical amenity access had to be some kind of processing mistake. The woman who answered the phone, after checking our account, confirmed there was no error. She explained, in a tone that suggested this was simply routine information rather than anything unusual, that the board had implemented what she called a legacy resident differential fee structure about 18 months earlier, under which homes purchased directly from the original developer, going back to the community's founding roughly 15 years earlier, paid the standard amenity fee, while homes that had since changed ownership through resale, meaning any family who had purchased their house from a previous owner rather than the developer itself, paid a substantially higher rate for the exact same pool and clubhouse access. I want to sit with how absurd this sounded to me in that first phone call, because it took me a moment to even process what she was describing. A fee structure that charged homeowners differently for identical community amenities, based entirely on whether they happened to be the very first family to ever own their specific house, regardless of how long they'd lived there, how much they'd contributed to the community, or anything else remotely related to actual amenity usage or community involvement, struck me as something that couldn't possibly be legally enforceable. Though I'll admit I had no specific legal knowledge at that point to back up that instinct beyond simple common sense. I asked the woman on the phone how many households were currently subject to this legacy resident differential. She told me she didn't have that information readily available, but could pass my question along to the board. I want to tell you that this response, vague and unhelpful as it was, ended up being the thing that pushed me from simple confused frustration into genuine investigative determination, because it meant nobody at the management level seemed to have a clear picture of how many families across our community of roughly 320 homes were being charged this surcharge, which suggested, at minimum, a policy that had been implemented with very little transparency or communication to the broader membership. I want to introduce you to my neighbor and closest friend in the community, a woman named Farah Nkemelu Whitfield, who lived 4 houses down and had, as it happened, purchased her own home from a second owner as well, meaning she was very likely subject to the exact same surcharge, though she told me, when I brought this up over coffee that same week, that she had simply assumed the higher amount on her own invoice reflected some kind of standard annual increase, rather than anything specifically targeting her ownership history, since she, like me, had never received any clear communication explaining the fee structure's actual basis. Farah and I decided together to do what I've since come to understand is the single most useful thing anyone in our position can do when facing an opaque, seemingly arbitrary HOA policy. We requested, in writing, the full text of whatever governing document or board resolution authorized this differential fee structure, citing our right as association members to review official association records related to fee assessments. What arrived, about 2 weeks later, after a delay that felt suspiciously long for what should have been a simple document request, was a copy of a board resolution passed roughly 18 months earlier, during a meeting that, based on the attendance records included with the document, had been sparsely attended, only around 15 homeowners present out of our community's 300-plus households. A detail that struck both Farah and me as significant once we understood what had actually been voted on that evening. The resolution itself cited, as its legal basis, a section of our community's original governing declaration addressing amenity access tiers, language that, when Farah and I actually pulled the full original declaration filed with the county when Ashcombe Meadows was first developed, turned out to describe something considerably narrower and more specific than what Priscilla's board had apparently built an entire fee structure around. I want to walk you through exactly what that original declaration language actually said, because this is the detail that ended up mattering more than anything else in this entire dispute. The amenity access tier clause, as originally written by the developer nearly 15 years earlier, had established a temporary, clearly time-limited provision allowing original purchasers during the community's initial construction and sales phase to receive discounted amenity fees for a specific 5-year period following the community's opening, as an incentive to attract early buyers during the initial development sales push. A fairly standard developer marketing provision that I understand appears in various forms across plenty of planned communities. That 5-year window, according to the declaration's own explicit language, had expired nearly 10 years before Priscilla's board ever passed its resolution. The provision Priscilla's board had cited as legal authority for an ongoing, permanent surcharge against non-original owners had, in fact, sunset entirely a full decade earlier, meaning the entire legal foundation for the legacy resident differential fee structure was built on a clause that no longer had any force or effect whatsoever under the community's own governing documents. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with Farah, both of us reading through that declaration language multiple times, making sure we weren't simply misunderstanding some more complex legal nuance, before Farah finally said, "Marisol, I don't think this is a nuance. I think she either didn't actually read the full declaration before basing a fee structure on it, or she read it and decided nobody would bother checking closely enough to notice it had already expired." I want to tell you about the decision Farah and I made at that kitchen table, because it's the moment this stopped being a private grievance about our own inflated invoices and became something considerably larger. We didn't yet know how many other families across Ashcombe Meadows were being charged this same surcharge. Families who, like Farah until that week, may have simply assumed a higher bill reflected some ordinary cost increase, rather than a deliberately targeted fee based on an expired provision nobody had bothered to verify. We decided to find out. That's where part 2 picks up, because what Farah and I discovered over the following month, going door to door through nearly the entire community with nothing more than a clipboard and a copy of that expired declaration clause, revealed a scope to this overcharging scheme that neither of us had remotely anticipated, and set in motion a chain of events that would end with Priscilla Vandermeer Ashby standing in front of the entire membership, forced to authorize refunds to nearly half the homes in our entire neighborhood. Farah and I spent the better part of a month going door to door through Ashcombe Meadows, a project that started small, just the two of us on weekend afternoons, and grew considerably once word began spreading, and other homeowners started volunteering to help canvass additional streets. Our approach was simple. We asked each household whether they had purchased their home directly from the original developer or from a previous owner, and if the latter, we asked them to check their most recent HOA invoice against a copy of the original expired declaration clause we brought with us, showing exactly where the sunset provision was written. What we found, once we'd compiled results from nearly every household in the community, staggered both of us. Of the 320-some homes in Ashcombe Meadows, 141 had changed ownership at least once since the community's founding, and of those, 138 were currently being charged the elevated legacy resident differential fee, meaning well over a third of our entire community had been paying, for the past 18 months, a tripled amenity fee based on a legal provision that had expired a full decade before Priscilla's board ever invoked it. I want to tell you about the reactions we got during that door-to-door process, because they ranged in a way that told us something important about how thoroughly this had gone unnoticed. Some families, like Farah, had simply assumed the higher amount reflected an ordinary fee increase and had never scrutinized it closely enough to notice the surcharge notation. Others told us they had noticed the discrepancy and even called the management office to ask about it, only to receive the same vague explanation I'd gotten, a legacy resident differential, described without any real detail about its actual legal basis, an explanation apparently designed, whether intentionally or simply through institutional carelessness, to sound official enough that most people didn't push further. A retired accountant named Bartholomew Ferrer Nkemelu, who lived on the far side of the community and had purchased his home from a previous owner nearly 9 years earlier, did some further math once he understood the scope of what we'd found, and told us something that added an entirely new dimension to the situation. If 138 households had been overcharged by roughly $400 annually for 18 months, the total amount improperly collected across the entire community came to somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000, a figure considerably larger than any of us had initially imagined when this started as nothing more than my own confusing invoice. I want to introduce you to the attorney who helped us formalize everything we'd found, a woman named Adiz Kowalski-Boyd, who Farah's husband knew through a professional connection and who specialized in HOA governance and fee assessment disputes. Adiz reviewed the expired declaration clause, the board resolution that had improperly cited it, and our door-to-door survey documenting the scope of affected households, and told us within our first meeting that this was, in her professional opinion, an unusually clean case of improper fee assessment. The declaration language here isn't ambiguous, she told us. It explicitly states a 5-year sunset provision tied to the community's initial sales period. That period ended, by the document's own plain language, nearly a decade before this board resolution was passed. There's no reasonable interpretation under which this surcharge was ever legally authorized, and given the scope you've documented, over a third of the community's households affected, this isn't a minor administrative oversight. This is a significant, ongoing overcharge that the board has been collecting for a year and a half based on a legal provision that simply doesn't exist anymore. Adiz helped us formally request a special meeting of the full membership, a request that, once the scope of the affected households became known through our own informal canvassing, gathered far more signatures than the minimum threshold required within just a few days, since it turned out an enormous number of families across the community had, once they understood what we'd found, real personal stakes in seeing this resolved. I want to walk you through that special meeting, because it was, without question, one of the more remarkable community gatherings I've ever been part of, held in a clubhouse that had never, in my 4 years living there, been anywhere close to as full as it was that evening, with well over 100 residents in attendance, many of them people I recognized from our door-to-door canvassing weeks earlier. Several holding printed copies of their own invoices, alongside the declaration language we'd shared with them. Adiz presented the case methodically, laying out the original declaration's explicit sunset language side by side with Priscilla's board resolution, walking the room through the math on how many households had been affected and for how long, and I watched. Throughout that presentation, the specific quality of a room full of people realizing, in real time, that they had personally and collectively been overcharged tens of thousands of dollars, based on a provision that any board member could have discovered didn't apply anymore with about 20 minutes of careful reading. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to argue that the board had relied on what she described as legal guidance in drafting the original resolution, a claim that Adiz immediately pressed her to substantiate by asking directly whether any licensed attorney had reviewed the resolution before it passed, or provided any written opinion supporting the interpretation that the sunset provision remained active. Priscilla could not produce any such documentation, and it became clear, over the course of several increasingly pointed questions from both Adiz and residents in the room, that the resolution had been drafted internally by Priscilla and one other board member, without any actual legal review at all, based entirely on what appeared to be a surface-level reading of the declaration that either missed or deliberately ignored the explicit sunset language. A man near the back of the room, someone I didn't recognize but who introduced himself as having purchased his home from a previous owner nearly 6 years earlier, asked the question that I think finally cemented the outcome of that meeting. "So for 18 months," he said, "you've been charging over a third of this neighborhood triple fees, based on a rule that expired a decade before you even wrote the resolution citing it, and nobody on the board thought to actually check the declaration's own language before doing this." Priscilla did not have a satisfying answer to that question, and the vote that followed was overwhelming, passed by a show of hands that Adiz later told me she'd rarely seen so lopsided in any HOA dispute she'd handled, immediately rescinding the fee resolution entirely, authorizing full refunds to every affected household covering the entire 18-month overcharge period, and removing Priscilla from the board effective that night given what the membership considered. Based on the discussion that unfolded, either a serious failure of basic diligence or a deliberate attempt to extract additional fees from a specific subset of residents who happened to be less likely, statistically, to scrutinize their invoices closely, since second and third generation homeowners tend, understandably, to pay somewhat less close attention to fee structures they've simply inherited as part of an existing household budget rather than something they negotiated fresh as a new buyer. I want to tell you about the process of actually distributing those refunds, because it took several months to fully complete, with the HOA's new interim board, led by Bartholomew, who was elected to the position, almost immediately following Priscilla's removal, given how much trust he'd built during the investigation process. Working alongside Adiz to calculate exact refund amounts for each of the 138 affected households, and issue individual checks reflecting the full overcharged amount, plus a modest interest adjustment that Adiz had successfully argued for as part of the settlement terms. I want to tell you what our own family did with our portion of that refund, because it felt, honestly, like a small but meaningful bookend to the whole ordeal. Teodoro and I used it, along with a portion Farah, and several other families contributed voluntarily, to fund a modest but permanent upgrade to the pool area itself, new shade umbrellas, and a proper set of accessible lounge chairs that had been on the community's wish list for years, but had never quite made it into any budget. A decision that felt like turning something that had started as a moment of feeling singled out and undervalued into something that benefited every single family who used that pool, original owner or not. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Adiz said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing that expired declaration clause for what felt like the dozenth time. She said that HOA boards, particularly ones that go unchallenged for long stretches, sometimes begin treating their own governing documents as flexible tools to be interpreted however best suits whatever policy they've already decided to implement, rather than as fixed, binding text that actually constrains what they're allowed to do. The moment residents actually read those documents closely, rather than simply trusting that whatever the board asserts must have some legitimate basis, that flexibility tends to evaporate considerably faster than anyone relying on it ever expects. We read closely, and it turns out that one confusing invoice, one expired sunset clause sitting quietly in a 15-year-old declaration nobody had bothered to check, and one afternoon of door-to-door canvassing with nothing more than a clipboard and a photocopy were more than enough to prove that Priscilla Vandermeer Ashby's entire fee structure had never had any legal foundation at all, and to bring nearly $80,000 back to the neighbors it had never had any right to leave in the first place. Thumbnail text. She charged US 444 no reason.